Now, this tale appears earliest in the Gospel of Mark. Matthew and Luke have their versions as well, but we can focus on Mark for now. Now, you say that this tale of Jesus' interaction with the demoniac is modeled on Odysseus' interaction with Polyphemus the giant, and also his interaction with Circe, the witch. So I think it'd be best to just go through the parallels one by one so we can see the sequence and density of the evidence you provide. I can read the biblical side and you can read the Homeric side, if that's how you want to do it.
Yes, that's the way I want to do it. And by the way, audience, notice all the effort that Nahoa has gone through to get these texts in front of you. It's a real treat. Sure, I'll read from Odyssey 9 and 10, and you'll read from 5, okay? Odysseus and his crew sailed to the land of the Cyclopes and of Circe.
Jesus and his disciples sailed to the region of the Gerasenes.
On the mountains of the Cyclopes, innumerable gates grazed, and Circe turned soldiers into swine.
On the mountain, a large herd of swine grazed.
Odysseus and crew of 12 chosen men disembarked.
Jesus and his crew disembarked.
They encountered a savage, lawless giant who lived in a cave.
They encountered a savage, lawless demoniac who lived among caves.
Polyphemus usually was depicted as nude.
The demoniac was nude.
Circe recognized Odysseus and asked him not to harm her. Odysseus said, "Swear me an oath not to plan another plot to hurt me." The giant asked if Odysseus intended to harm him.
The demoniac recognized Jesus and asked him not to harm him. Quote, "I adjure you by God, do not torment me."
The
Unquote.
giant asked Odysseus his name.
Jesus asked the demoniac his name.
Odysseus answered, "Nobody is my name."
The demoniac answered, "Legion is my name."
Odysseus subdued the giant with violence and trickery. Circe's magic turned Odysseus' soldiers swine.
Jesus subdued about 2,000 demons with divine power and sent them into the swine and then drove the swine into the lake.
Polyphemus the shepherd called out to his neighbors.
The swineherds called on their neighbors.
The Cyclopes came to the site asking about Polyphemus' stolen sheep.
The Gerasenes came to the site to find out about their swine.
Odysseus and crew embarked.
Jesus and his disciples embarked.
Odysseus told the giant to proclaim that he had blinded him.
Jesus told the healed demoniac to proclaim what God had done for him.
The giant asked Odysseus, now aboard, to come back.
The demoniac asked Jesus, now aboard ship, if he could be with him.
Odysseus refused the request.
Jesus refused the request.
Odysseus and his crew sailed away.
Jesus and his disciples sailed away.
Odysseus awoke during a tempest in an episode immediately following the story of the Cyclopes.
Jesus awoke during a tempest and calmed the wind and sea just before exorcising the demoniac.
Now, if those parallels, Nahoa, were found with the Jewish Bible, there would be no controversy about the relationship. But because they're found in Homer, scholars almost routinely dismiss them. But as I was saying before, Homer was much better known than the Septuagint. So that these parallels require a mimetic connection. Otherwise, it's just folly.
You acknowledge that a lot of the examples you point to in your book aren't going to convince anyone by themselves. But you say that certain clear examples can help you to appreciate the rest of the evidence. And this is one of the clearest examples, I think. I mean, the parallels are dense and sequential, meaning they're, for the most part, in the same order in both Mark and in the Odyssey. There are several distinctive parallels as well. They're not just kind of basic, vague similarities. So, if you're going to point to a story as evidence for mimesis, this might be one of the best candidates.
This would be one of the top three or four, I think, in the Gospel of Mark, but there are also very distinctive ones in the Acts of the Apostles. But I think, Nohoa, this would be a good time for me to talk about my criteria for this. Because it is such an adventurous hypothesis, one has to be really careful about not being cavalier or subjective about the assessment. So I'm going to go through my 7 criteria, and there's an 8 that is possible that we can also talk about. And I'm going to put it in the form of questions to you, and you give me the answer. The first criterion is accessibility. Was the Odyssey available to Mark and his readers? Absolutely. I mean, it was a part of the intellectual furniture, and not just for readers, but also for people who knew Greek mythology. Analogy. Do we have examples of other imitations of the Circe story and the Polyphemus story? And you'd have to know more than a high schooler will know about Greek and Latin literature, but I can tell you that Virgil has an extensive imitation of the story of Polyphemus, and Circe makes cameo appearances twice. So, yes, there are analogies to imitations of this story. Now, the next 3 criteria are density, sequence or order, and distinctiveness, that they are similar. What do you think about the parallels being dense, sequential, and distinctive?
I mean, it seems compelling to me, at least prima facie. Um, yeah, I'll just say that for now.
Well, that's all you have to say for now. But also, there are Greek words that are the same. The word for questioning a name, an onoma, is the same. The words for embarking and disembarking are the same. The words for having an oath or adjuring are similar to each other. So it's we actually have distinctiveness even at the point of language. Now, interpretability is an explanation of why an author would go to the trouble of rewriting a story. So, would you rather have as a moral hero Odysseus, who blinds Polyphemus and steals his sheep, or Jesus, who turns a demoniac into his right mind and clothes him?
Probably Jesus.
Yeah, yeah, probably Jesus. I would certainly hope so. So there you have a moral movement, and the same thing happens in Virgil in his story of Polyphemus. Aeneas is much more compassionate than Odysseus, who's treated as a scumball. The final criterion is ancient recognition. Did ancient authors recognize the similarities between the story of the Gerasene demoniac and Polyphemus? And the answer is sounding yes. The authors of the Homeric Centones that begin in probably the 5th century and continue at least to the 9th begin their account of the Gerasene demoniac story by using almost unaltered the first 11 poetic lines from Homer that are identical or nearly identical, just reshaped for the new environment. So, yes, they saw the similarities. Now, I'm not saying that they thought Mark imitated Homer. I don't know how one would make that judgment. but they certainly saw the similarities. And by the way, in some of the critiques of my work that you've read and shared with me before this podcast, people have said, well, why is it, Dennis, that nobody has seen these parallels for 2,000 years of reading and interpretation? And my answer is that we know that lots of people saw it and weren't scandalized by it the same way that modern biblical scholars are. And I can give you more examples of that. But this is why I think the model that you've chosen to begin with for our analysis is so useful, because here we have a satisfaction of all of the criteria of mimesis criticism. The final example, the final criterion, if there is an eighth one, it would be this one. If you don't like this model for the Gerasene demoniac, show me a better one. Grab one from Hebrew Bible, I dare you. Grab one from the history of Israel in other literature. There are none. This is a Greek story. Jesus is sailing. That's something that is typical of the Odyssey, surrounded by nincompoop sailors and so on. So this is a great example. I'm glad you chose it.
Yeah, I think this is a great example. If I might push back a little bit on that last part, you said try to find some other literary explanation or model of intertextuality that doesn't refer to Homer. But what if someone says you don't need to because this story in Mark 5 is not literarily dependent on some other fiction? What if it's simply rooted in historical tradition, perhaps oral tradition circulating throughout churches, or even just memory, recollection of the events? I mean, more conservative scholars would say Mark derives a lot of his information from the disciple and eyewitness, Peter, someone who was supposedly there when these things took place, disembarking and embarking with Jesus, seeing and hearing what happened, and thus being in a position to tell Mark. Now, of course, I'm sure you're not going to agree with any of this, but I am curious what you'd say to someone else who says we don't need to find some other parallel in Jewish or Greco-Roman literature, because at the very least, the story in Mark 5 has a historical core, even if it might be expressed in Homeric language.
Okay, that's a very articulate way to ask about this methodology, and it's one that scholars have talked about in the past. And yes, I won't agree with the criticism that you're articulating, but I do think that there are some things to explore about your question. The first is a literary judgment is not the same as a historical judgment. That someone could say that there was a historical kernel, a recognition of an exorcism that Mark saw as an analogy to what was going on in the epic, and used certain elements from the story of Polyphemus to adorn it. So, I'm not arguing that Jesus wasn't an exorcist. In fact, he's an exorcist also in the Q document. And we know in ancient Jewish society and in Greek society, there were people who were divinization experts, exorcists and magicians. And so why should we not consider Jesus to have been cataloged among that kind of group? But the big problem with it is, how do you explain all the parallels then? So that you have some kind of core story. What does that story look like? Does it include, and I'm sorry, I'm going to really press back to you, Nahoa, and the people that you talk about. Do you really think Jesus cast 2,000 demons into swine, drowned them in the lake, and they call themselves Legion, which is, of course, a reference to Roman military power? This is pure propagandistic mythology, and there is no historical core whatever to that story. And if you can find one that comes close, let me know. Porphyry, in reading that story, says, "What a bunch of nonsense that you could have." And I think that that's still true. If you want to make that a historical story, even in its kernel, you are really anti intellectual and anti scientific. There is really no justification for that judgment. Now, again, I'm arguing that Jesus was not an exorcist. I'm not arguing that a literary judgment is the same as a historical judgment. I am saying that an explanation of this story as alternative mythology makes a ton of more sense than any other interpretation I've ever seen.